I recently found out that 1 in 6 Central Texans is at risk of hunger. I was kind of blown away by that statistic. And we hope that by the end of this hour, all of us have a better understanding of the systems that come into play to help our community become less food insecure, less hungry. There are so many dedicated groups that are taking part in this critical work in our city and in Central Texas as a whole. Many of them are here today. We have folks from Meals on Wheels Central Texas, the Central Texas Food Bank, and if you want to engage with some of those folks afterwards, I'm sure they would welcome some interesting conversations about what their groups are doing to tackle this issue. But first of all, we have the experts here on our panel to hear from today, and I want to introduce them to you. First of all, we have Edwin Marty. He is the Food Policy Manager for the City of Austin's Office of Sustainability. He was the founder and director of the nonprofit Jones Valley Teaching Farm located in Birmingham, Alabama. He co-authored a book about urban farming called Breaking Through Concrete. Love that title. Then we have Rhonda Rutledge. She's the Executive Director of Sustainable Food Centers. She serves on the working group of the Austin-Travis County Food Policy Board. She is also chair this year of One Voice Central Texas. And most importantly, she is an alum of the 2014 class of Leadership Austin.
Best class ever. Best class ever.
Best class ever. Some other years might disagree, but for you, Rhonda, 2014 is the best class ever. And then we have Brian Bowser. He is the Regional Director for the American Heart Association's Advocacy Department. During the last several years, Brian has worked on state and local campaigns related to healthy food access. We're going to find out a lot more about access and its importance in the big picture, healthy vending, and active transportation. Thanks so much for all you all do in the space of hunger and food insecurity in our community. I want to start with a broad question for everybody. I know that last year the city released the Austin Healthy Food Access Initiative, and I believe that's now called Fresh for Less. And I know that each of your groups had a part in this, and I want to know, what was the most surprising part of this report? And also, what are we going to do with this information? Because I think sometimes we do all these studies and then we don't know what happens to that information, but I know there's some actively involved groups making sure that information is put into place in the community. So, Edwin, I'll start with you.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and thank you so much for letting us come talk about really important and critical issues in Central Texas. I'm somewhat of a newcomer to Austin, only been here about 4 years, and the Healthy Food Access Initiative effort was a critical part of my learning about Central Texas and Austin, Travis County. And as part of that, I think, as you touched on, sort of the staggering amount of food insecurity in a city as affluent as Austin, it was a real eye-opener for me, moving from a place like Birmingham, Alabama, where poverty was a fairly well-accepted, unfortunately, reality and a very visible part of the community, moving to Austin with an expectation that I was moving to the home of Whole Foods and the greatest city on the planet. And driving around, you don't see the same kind of poverty that you see in a lot of other cities, and it's very easy to sort of think that we all are living this great Central Texan dream. The research that we did really indicated that there's a significant percentage of the population that's not participating in that dream. Obviously, there's incredible organizations like the Sustainable Food Center and Meals on Wheels and the Food Bank, et cetera, that have been working on this issue for decades. And other organizations nationally that have been working on these issues for centuries, and yet here we are in 2017 with the grim reality that we still have this incredible level of inequity.
Rhonda, by the way, Rhonda Rutledge has graciously pinch hitted for us and filled in for Carmen Polito with GAVA, who fell ill this morning, and we appreciate you being up here. So tell us about your role in this report and what you thought some of the findings that were surprising and what your group is doing with this information.
Again, I'm really happy to be here. I was supposed to be taking questions from all of you guys, and now I'm on the other side of that panel. But very happy to be here and participate. We've been doing this work for a really long time in the community. SFC was founded in 1975, so part of what I really appreciated about the report is, when our organization started, it was really around how can we utilize the fact that there's a year-round growing season in Central Texas. We can grow food literally, every month out of the year. Something can grow out of the ground to eat. And we wanted to really utilize the fact that we have that year-round growing season to try to bolster more people growing food for themselves and their families. And a lot of their ability to do that is actually a little bit hamstrung by certain sort of regulations or usage stipulations in terms of, city-owned land and things like that. And one of the things that I really, appreciated about the report is that it encompassed kind of all different levels of how do we access food. It's because people across our community access food in very different ways. And while our focus may be on local production and where can you access local food, we're also dealing with farmers trying to get that produce out into the hands of more Austinites, and we're dealing with folks who want to use their public benefits and are unable to actually enroll in the SNAP program, for example, because of how difficult it is. And we've got incredible organizations that try to make it less difficult, but the bottom line is that a lot of people who are eligible for public benefits that they have do not take advantage of them. We send a lot more money back to the federal government than we actually keep here in our local economy that could actually drive and grow our economy, because there's just so many people actually who are eligible, and it's not an easy process to sign up for those benefits. So I think what I appreciated is just that it was a very all-encompassing and inclusive report and process to just really look at this issue from every possible angle. And like the organizations that you just mentioned and several more in our community are really participating at different levels of hunger relief and, for us, sustainable agriculture.
And Brian, what does this information mean for the Heart Association?
Yeah, well, again, good morning. Thanks for having us. Really glad to be here. Our mission is to improve the cardiovascular health of all Americans. We really need to make an impact in nutrition and food and how people consume food. And so much of that is, what you put into your body, and we can't affect heart disease and stroke without addressing food and nutrition. So for us, the report really gave a comprehensive roadmap for some policy solutions to address food security in Austin, because for such a large population in Austin and Travis County to not have access to healthy, affordable foods was really eye-opening, and there are a number of kind of policy solutions, policy levers that we engage in as an advocacy organization to help address some of that. But for our perspective, we really look at it as a food access issue that really needed to be addressed.
So we're talking about food accessibility as one of the key issues in solving this problem in our community. I want to talk about the barriers to accessing healthy food. I know there was a study done in the Runberg area on some of the roadblocks and barriers that that are preventing people from really having access to food. Talk about that study and just talk about in general what's standing in the way of people getting healthy, nutritious food in their communities.
We did, as part of a grant-funded project called Plan for Health, a pilot program in the Runberg area, north central Austin. We called it a neighborhood food system planning process. We were interested in, could we do a deep dive in one specific neighborhood and really unpack what is sort of the things you touched on. What is food access? What are the barriers? Where are the opportunities? Where are the assets? And then what's the role with the city to help align those liabilities, potentially to turn them into assets? The north central Austin neighborhoods are really complicated. Austin in general is a complicated place, but north central Austin is particularly complicated, especially for a newcomer to Austin, to try to understand the complexities of a neighborhood that at any given time you could hear 38, 40 different languages being spoken. And you have an infrastructure that for the most part was designed for large warehouses and then transformed over the years to be basically the main location for low-income multifamily housing. That infrastructure doesn't support things like public transportation in an effective way. So we were trying to unpack what are those barriers to these community members accessing healthy, affordable food. And it's a really, really complicated process to understand that. We understood through the work that there's no simple solution, there's no silver bullet, there's no one thing that you can say, if we just did this way, that we would solve the issue. What we did see was that there are incredible assets. We did tremendous amount of outreach with individuals and focus groups and businesses, and just the amazing people that we came across, across the board. Incredible people doing incredible things. And what we heard, I think the most profound thing that we heard across the board was that everybody wanted to feed their family healthy food. There was not a single person that we talked to that was not really interested in feeding their family healthy food. And I think there's a perception, especially in America, that low-income, often minority families that don't have access to healthy food in the same way that some other families do, just simply don't want that food, and that's not their priority. And what we saw was that it's a real big struggle every single day for a family, especially in a low-income neighborhood, specifically in Austin, to try to make the compromises that you have to make. And the way that our society, unfortunately, is set up right now, those compromises often mean, do I pay for health care? Do I buy shoes for my kid? Do I pay the rent? Or do I buy the kind of food that I value and that I want to put on my family's plate? And unfortunately, that, the variables, food is often the most variable thing in a person's budget, and it's the thing that you can sort of most easily compromise on, and therefore that's often what gets compromised the most. And it's not necessarily a question that it's not a value to a family, but it's just simply the thing that you have the most flexibility on. So our research in North Central Austin really gave us the opportunity to talk to individuals and spend a lot of time getting to the bottom of that quandary that these families are up against. And so that led to us trying to understand, how do we address that challenge of the stress of having to make those difficult decisions? What's the role of the city to help families be able to make better decisions based on their family's budget? So
Equitable accessibility to food. How do we get there? I mean, what are let's talk about some of those challenges. You mentioned that those tough choices are there every day for a lot of these low-income families. So how can we permanently, or at least start chipping away at those barriers? Rhonda, you want to take that one?
It's a great question. I think we're all looking at that. Equity in general across the board for healthcare, for food security, for all of these things. I think one thing that has to happen, and I know one thing that we really focus on, and I know I'll speak a little bit for Carmen since she wasn't able to be here today, that GAVA, which is Go Austin, Vamos Austin, which is a very place-based initiative of health in the zip codes of 44 and 45, what they focus on is having the community drive the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Really kind of, instead of policymakers or service providers kind of going into a community thinking that we know what's best for that community, or we provide these kinds of services and so this is what we offer, turning that around to say there's inherent leadership that already exists in all of these complicated neighborhoods that Edwin mentioned. Who are the leaders in those communities, and what do they want to see that would help provide more equitable access to healthy food, and have them drive a lot of those conversations and make those decisions. And that's very much the work of GAVA in those particular areas. And it's a driving factor for a lot of the programs that we do at Sustainable Food Center. It's what does the community want? What are their assets? Which I think is another great thing that Edwin touched on that they did in the Runberg areas. There's already incredible assets there. Yes, there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of assets there. How do you capitalize on that and really provide any kind of additional infrastructure or training or whatever it is that the community is saying that they want and that they need, and then being those advocates at the policy level to make the kinds of changes that make it easier to grow and share and prepare healthy local food. Because there's a lot of barriers to doing that, and a lot of these community members, I've been to at City Hall, until midnight on some of these nights when we're advocating for more funding for social service contracts and more funding for this kind of work. And the community is showing up, and they are there, and they have their families with them. And that's what you've got to see, are those voices in the room at the table, inviting others to their table. Not always that it's our table, come sit with us. It's let us come to your table and help in whatever way, is appropriate for your neighborhood and your family.
I'm discovering just how political food is. Who knew? And I know that's with the American Heart Association, that's kind of your role on the advocacy front. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you talk about barriers, there's couple tracks, and there's a couple games we have to play at the same time. One is the long game, and all of those social determinants of health that we talk about that include education and transportation and housing and really the root causes of a lot of the barriers. And then there's also the short game, like where we need to, in the very short term, increase access to healthy foods, affordable foods, and programs that can assist people where they're living to have those options, those healthier options. So those games need to be played concurrently and at the same time and thoughtfully and together and strategically. And so we have supported some initiatives that with the Sustainable Food Center, City of Austin, GAVA, to help the influx of healthy foods in corner stores. GAVA is running a great Healthy Corner Stores program in their zip codes to get that immediate help sooner rather than later. And so we've helped support, advocate for those programs. And from our perspective, we want to see those well-funded, robust programs. We don't deliver a service, we don't run a program. We want to make sure those programs that Sustainable Food Center, that GAVA runs, are well-funded and successful.
So you mentioned the corner store initiative and the Healthy Corner Store, and I found out about this talking to Carmen a little bit and to you all by phone. But I think that everybody would like, I want to explain how this works, and I think it sounds like something that's going on across the country, and we're starting to try it in different areas of town now. And then we'll take some audience questions after that.
And I can just give a quick overview of the initiatives that we're working on to sort of tee off of what Brian said. I think really perfectly that it's a short-term, immediate issue, but it's also a really big, long-term issue, and we have to think about both those things at the same time. I guess to frame sort of the challenge, and this is a phrase I just came up with, so go with it. We have the Great American Food System Contradiction. And what I mean by the Great American Food System Contradiction is that we need food to be more expensive and we need food to be less expensive. And we need those things to happen simultaneously. So what the heck does that mean? So farmers, and Rhonda touched on this perfectly, aren't getting paid the price that they need to cover the cost of production, and certainly not the cost of production from a sustainable point of view, and certainly not the cost of production if we include things like fair labor. So literally our food does not cover the cost of production. We have a radically subsidized food economy where most of the true costs of food are hidden. So farmers aren't getting the money to do good production. And then on the other hand, as we've touched on, the vast majority of food insecure people just simply need cheaper food. They need food to be less expensive. So this is a real interesting contradiction when we think about it from a policy point of view. How do you get something to be more expensive and less expensive at the same time? So fortunately, contradictions are not bad things. We can embrace contradiction, and we can sort of recognize that maybe the issue of the contradiction is that we're not looking at this issue correctly. So what we're trying to do is, as Brian touched on, sort of look at short-term, immediate issues and then this long-term game. The short-term issue is taking city funds and infusing them into local communities through organizations that are already on the ground doing good work, like the Sustainable Food Center, like the Food Bank, like GAVA, and like Farm Share Austin. So we funded some initiatives that were already basically bubbling up around how do we get high quality, locally produced, ideally affordable food into communities where people are currently living that are not able to access healthy, affordable food for whatever reason. And so that entails Healthy Corner Stores, which is the work that GAVA is working on in 7745 and 44, and farm stands that Sustainable Food Center is running at schools and community centers, and Farm Share Austin is running mobile grocery stores in communities. So all these places are basically being pinpointed in terms of where we know through our mapping and outreach efforts that large concentrations of people aren't able to access healthy, affordable food for whatever reason. Can we infuse those communities with direct access, improve that immediate ability to get good, high-quality food?
So I'm guessing farmers markets, we think of that's a great place to get fresh produce, but that's not necessarily an affordable thing, right? Unless they're in this instance when
That's
you
the perfect
targeted.
contradiction that Edwin was talking about, absolutely, because farmers are our clients. They are primarily low-income individuals in our community. Many people who grow food in our community qualify for public benefits, for SNAP and those kinds of things. So, and a lot of people don't know that, or they don't realize that. And in order for them to actually grow food in a way that is, I would argue, healthier, which is without a lot of toxins and just their growing practices that help the soil to regenerate so that they can continue to grow on that land year after year, and pay their farm workers fair wages, and have farm worker treatment to be taken care of in an appropriate way. All of that, it costs money to do that. And so that is the argument that people say is, great, you've got these, there's 17 farmers markets in Austin right now. And, a lot of people feel like they can't afford to purchase food there. We have a double dollars program that allows for, if you are on public benefits, SNAP, WIC, Farmers Market Nutrition Program, you can come to the market, and when you swipe your Lone Star card to get $30 in produce, we're going to match it up to $30 per week for fresh produce. So not only is that low-income family getting the $30 that they're using their SNAP on, but we're going to match it dollar for dollar, $30 a week. So they're getting $60 in produce. Well, what does that also do? It brings additional funding to the farmer. So it's a win-win on both sides. And it's also helping build these relationships between these customers and the farming community so that they can have that kind of dialogue around and ask questions about the way they grew their food, and what do you do with this kohlrabi, that I've never seen before, or whatever. That's how I felt when I first started going to farmers markets.
What is that, Rhonda?
Kohlrabi, it's a root vegetable.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We should have brought.
I learned something new today.
That just kind of reminds me of some of the arguments we hear, whether it's the corner store initiative or any other initiative, that the demand isn't there, that people aren't asking for the food. People go to the corner stores to buy their sodas and their chips, and they don't want the fresh produce there. And I think we can help drive demand by putting the healthy foods in those establishments, but we can't stop there. So A, I think we need to put the healthy foods where people are, but B, we still need to do a great job of the consumer education, of health education, to encourage people to buy those healthier foods when they're there. And so that's a big part of what we do, as well as that consumer education piece.
And I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I know you were just about to say the word farm bill. I know you were, which we want to call the food bill, because that's what it is. Everybody thinks our big mammoth national farm bill is about farming, and it's actually about food across the board, all aspects of food. There's a very incredible diagram on the CDC's website that shows the amount of subsidized food in our community, and the vast majority of that goes to grains that are being fed to animals that weren't meant to eat them in the first place, so that you can kind of keep this whole system going of meats and grains and very, very little at all for fresh produce, which is called in the Farm Bill specialty crops.
Specialty crops?
That's what we call
Okay.
fruits and vegetables in this country.
AKA food.
Specialty crops. So how about we flip that? Okay, now I'm going off on him, so I'm just gonna sit back. That could be a
So
whole
this
other
is,
talk.
we're talking about what's before Congress, right? This is a
Yes.
national bill. Okay.
Happening right now, being
Okay.
debated.
And it really does touch on that exact Great American food system contradiction is written into the Farm Bill. And we have an opportunity as the general public to influence the Farm Bill. It's the single biggest way that we influence what the food system looks like. I think a simple analogy to think about, when I was 22 years old and started as an organic farmer, I was convinced that I could help change the way the food system worked. And I saw the food system train moving down the track, and as a young, fired up, not very smart kid, jumped on the train and tried to grab the wheel and change the direction of that train. And lo and behold, some of you might have tried to drive a train before. They don't have wheels. You can't change the direction. They either go fast or slow, and that's basically the only controls you have. And so the way I like to think about the food system is it's a train and it moves down a track, and we put down those tracks to direct the train where it's going to go. The Farm Bill is what decides where those tracks get laid, and they get laid 5 years to 10 years ahead. And so you can't necessarily just jump on the train and change the direction. So what we do, and this maybe to Brian's point of the long game, we think about the Farm Bill as basically, where do we put the switching stations in the food system? where do we build the bridges, and who do we decide gets served by that train track? And so when the train goes down that train track, it's going to serve some people, and it may not serve other people. And so I think the real simple way to think about the food system is right now our food system doesn't serve a significant percentage of our population. The Farm Bill is the way that we could potentially change that by putting in new bridges, by building new switching stations, and it's up to us. The Farm Bill is being written as we speak. We have elected officials in Texas that have a huge amount of influence over the language in that Farm Bill. If you're not concerned about it, you should be. Right now, given the totality of the political environment, who knows what's going to end up, in that bill. It will be the single thing that influences this conversation for the next 5 to 10 years.
So that'll probably be one of the actionable ways we can leave this building and do something. Okay, let's turn to some questions from the audience, from you guys.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. I want to first go to Rhonda's point about the community, leaning on the community and utilizing the resources there. And it's no surprise that our audience has questions and comments about some creative solutions that we can be addressing. So some of the things coming up are how does the media and public relations play a role? Where do communities of faith, where can they step in? And grocery stores with expiring food, can we be creative there? So just throwing out some of the solutions that the audience is throwing out there and wanting to get your response on those.
I'll just say that in terms of GAVA, that's a coalition of a lot of different organizations that work in the 4445 area, which include faith-based organizations. So that's, they look at everything from, they're looking at physical activity and food intake, so healthy food. So there a lot of that is already happening in a lot of these communities. I know one example that I can use just from Sustainable Food Centers, we have a lot of folks who've been through our Happy Kitchen La Cocina Alegre program, and that's a 6-week cooking series that and you're looking at the food pyramid, if you will. We call it our Happy Plate, and looking at different aspects of the Happy Plate along that 6-week series. And at the end of that, we've had people who graduated from that class who said, I really want to take this back to my church. I don't really like the food that's being served at my church or my school or my rec center. And those folks become facilitators through the Happy Kitchen, and that way the vast majority of our free 6-week series that are taught out in the community are taught by community members who are not employees of SFC. They are given a stipend, and we provide a lot of the materials, and they run this program on their own, and a lot of them are happening in churches around Austin. That's just one example, but do other people?
I'm going to just touch on the baffling way that we have constructed the food system support network in America. I've been working on this for 22 years and still not completely sure I can tell you how you can get enrolled in SNAP, aka food stamps. It's a really complicated process to understand who's eligible, who's not eligible, and and how you go about getting benefits that you're eligible for. We know in the Austin area about 47% of the community that's eligible for SNAP is not enrolled. As Rhonda touched on, that's millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money that sits in a pot that we're not getting. Not only are we not getting that money that we're eligible for in the community, those dollars don't bounce around in our community. So there's lots of sort of residue of that. So how do we get more people enrolled that are eligible for SNAP in our community? And we've just done some research working with the UT School of Public Health. And not surprisingly, it's a really complicated equation. But at the end of the day, going back to what Rhonda said, what we need is more grassroots organizations and faith-based organizations that have a deep level of competency around what benefits are out there for communities, and then how to communicate that in a very clear and systematic way. Unfortunately, we've got things working in opposition to that. There is intentional confusion, in my perspective, about the eligibility requirements. It's a very complicated thing, and especially if you're not a English-speaking as a first language community member, you're going to have a really hard time navigating who's eligible and who's not eligible. And I think we, I take personal responsibility, city employee, we need to do a better job of addressing that issue, of funding organizations that have the capacity to cut through that confusion and to make it as absolutely simple as possible for people to get enrolled who are eligible for the benefits that will make their families healthier.
What else is bubbling up, Julie?
I'll just say real quickly on the
Oh, sure. Sorry,
media
Brian.
question, because that came up. I think the media can play an essential, critical role to just elevating the issue of food insecurity in Austin. I think when we go and talk to people not living in those underserved communities, there is a lack of understanding that there is a problem in Austin. And so I think to that extent, the media can elevate the issue because if you have a car, if you have easy access to a grocery store, if you don't see the problem, you're not quite aware that there is one out there.
And the media is elevating the conversation right now.
Live.
Live on Facebook. Go ahead, Julie.
Is there a stigma that you see around people who raise their hand, ask for help, apply for SNAP? And if so, what do we do about that?
We came across that directly in the research that we just did. It's probably the single biggest reason that people don't enroll in SNAP is because they think that SNAP is not for them. You know, even though they don't have enough money to buy the food that they want to put on their family's plate, that's not part of their sort of personal perception of themselves. And that's a tragedy that we've created this stigma in America that if you're not able to meet the basic needs of your family, that you shouldn't go out and find the resources that you need. I mean, it's a really complex issue, and I think we have to get to the bottom of it. It's probably one of the most important things that we can look at in terms of addressing the overall complex of poverty in America. We know in Austin it's a really significant issue. We look at the map of what we call the SNAP gap, those that are eligible that are not enrolled, and it's all across Austin. Every single part of Austin has significant pockets of community members that are eligible but not enrolled, and we know some of that's a misunderstanding just from the complexity of the issue, but it's also a stigmatized issue. So how can we as a community sort of address that and not basically shame people for being unable to provide the things that they need for their family? Austin's a really expensive place to live. I heard a staggering number recently that you need to make about $120,000 a year for a family of four to basically live without going in debt. It's basically the number. And you think about $120,000 a year, that's really far from what we consider the poverty level, or even the 185% of poverty, which is usually sort of standard cutoff for a lot of benefit programs. I mean, it's not even like close. I mean, we're talking about such a massive gap in income for basic family members to live, in a way that they have dignity. It's a real big challenge, and I think we as a community have to embrace it. Paul's not here, but I'm going to point at him. He touched on, I think, a really critical issue. Poverty is solvable. Poverty is solvable. It's a policy issue. We in America have forgotten that. We think that poverty is just this thing. It's just like this mountain that exists. But poverty is a choice that we make as a society, and we can unmake that. It's difficult. We're not making those choices right now, but we can address that. And if we truly care about food insecurity, I think it's beholden upon us to really understand the true core reasons that we have food insecurity in America. As much as I would like to say that we need to create a more efficient, effective food system, yes, we have to do that. We have to address the fact that we're throwing 40% of our food away, and we have to address other issues. But at the end of the day, it's about people in the community not having enough money to buy the food that they want to put on their plate. And we as a society are the cause of that at some level. It's really complicated to unpack. But what I like to think about is, what I like to talk about is, we can't get to the true systemic causes of things if we don't understand the true issue. And if we sugarcoat things and talk about food system issues in one way or another without embracing that fundamental concept, we're never going to get to the true ways to improve quality of life for absolutely everybody in our society.
Well said. And I think that we do a lot of that treating the symptoms rather than the cause. And I want to talk about, we're taking a holistic approach this morning, so can we talk a little bit more about how housing affordability and transportation and other social equity issues play into the food picture, the food insecurity picture? Who wants to tackle that one? Because I understand that,
definitely
we from everything I'm hearing this morning, as you said, this is a multifaceted thing. It's not just, let's put a grocery store up, let's put some food in the neighborhoods that's affordable and healthy. I mean, we have to attack the poverty issue, and part of poverty is, as you said, families can't pay for housing, they can't pay for transportation, they can't pay for medicine, and then food gets left off as
And
a
I
low
guess
man on the totem pole.
I can sort of describe something I talk about a lot, which is this triangulation of housing, transportation, and food. If we try to solve for food system issues without looking at the correlation between housing and transportation, we're never going to get there. It's a moving triangle that will always adjust to make sure that nobody is going to have enough food. So we have to think about it in this complex. And if we don't, we get into the sort of the quandary that we have now. There's this concept of food deserts that many of you have probably heard of, and it's a really useful phrase developed by geographers years ago. And it's basically this triangulation of household income, access to a vehicle, and proximity to a full-service grocery store. And it's a really useful phrase in terms of being able to map inequity in our society. The USDA has a thing called it's now called the Food Environment Atlas. It used to be called the Food Desert Atlas, but it basically just shows by zip code who has access to a full-service grocery store. And the reason it's relevant is because we know that grocery stores are where the vast majority of us get our food, and the vast majority of us, especially low-income populations, get affordable food. Grocery stores are unquestionably the way that we get the cheapest food. And so most low-income families are going to grocery stores to buy food. If you live a long way from a grocery store, it's pretty logical to think, especially if you don't have a vehicle, that you're going to have a real serious problem getting that high-quality and ideally healthy food. So it's a useful triangulation of data points. Unfortunately, what it leaves out is that simply putting a grocery store in a low-income neighborhood doesn't solve that issue inherently. It's a part of a solution or part of a response, but it's not going to solve the problem. And here's the analogy, and I'll say this recognizing the beautiful church that we're sitting in. I grew up going to an Episcopal church in Birmingham, Alabama, despite the fact that we lived 2 doors down from a Church of Christ church. We never went to the Church of Christ church. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but just we were Episcopalian. So we drove across town and we went to the Episcopal church. And we never thought about it. It was never discussed. Like, shouldn't we just walk down the street 2 doors to go to this church as opposed to drive across town? Never considered. So if you think about food access in the same way that you could think about religious access or religious access deficiencies, if we made a map in the same way that the USDA made the food desert map that showed what communities don't have access to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, you could easily say, okay, here's a deficiency, here's the red circle that lacks these access points. We should solve that problem by dropping a synagogue or a church or a mosque into that red dot, and that would solve the religious accessibility issue. Now, obviously, you can clearly see that's not going to solve the issue because religion is a deeply personal thing. Food is also a deeply personal thing. You make decisions about your food probably in a very similar way to the reasons that you choose a church or whatever drives your faith decisions. It's basically the same process. It's a reflection of your culture. It's a reflection of your values. You go to shop somewhere because it reflects your values. It meets your needs in the totality of you as a human and your family. So to think about sort of addressing food access issues without understanding all those levels of complexity, we get into some potentially, I guess I would say, sort of wrong thinking. For instance, if we look at that map and say, here's an area that doesn't have access to a grocery store, we should put a grocery store there. The city should incentivize a grocery store, which has been done in some places, and frankly has been done well and been done appropriately. If we put a Whole Foods, for instance, or if we incentivized Whole Foods to go into a low-income neighborhood and build a beautiful grocery store, that would address the food desert issue. It would erase the redness from the map because there would be a grocery store there. But would that low-income neighborhood that surrounds that Whole Foods be able to access the food that's culturally appropriate for those families? Probably be some issues, and there are good precedents of the example being played out in Detroit. Whole Foods does great stuff. They provide incredible things to the community. And in Detroit specifically, they created incredible jobs for the communities surrounding the Whole Foods that was built in Detroit. But it didn't necessarily solve the food access challenge because people can't afford necessarily to go to Whole Foods to get the kind of food that they want. So we have to sort of unpack that thought and really start thinking about the complexity of issues and the stuff I love that the Sustainable Food Center is doing, and the Food Bank and Meals on Wheels and GAVA and FarmShare Austin is really trying to unpack those issues and get to the bottom of how do we support communities to do things that they think are important and that they value. And frankly, I think that's the most important thing for the city to do, is listen carefully and thoughtfully and try to respond to those community needs to provide the assets in the ways that the community wants to see them.
All politics is local.
Yes, indeed.
And I think it just highlights
Yes.
real quickly the need to have all of those community partners at the table. So if we know that this is an education problem and an affordable housing problem and a transportation problem, as we community plan, as we coalition build, as we advocate, all those community groups, all those members need to be at the table and having that input as we look for the policy solution, so it is a comprehensive solution.
And
Good point,
frankly,
Brian.
that's why groups like One Voice exist. You know, One Voice is a coalition of over 100 human service organizations in Central Texas. And, you know, those groups all recognize that individually we don't have as much bargaining power, if you will, or as much of a say at the legislature or at City Hall or wherever. But collectively, as 100 groups that are touching on all of these issues, housing, healthcare, transportation, food, shelter, clothing, all of it, that's a powerful coalition. That's a group that collectively can make a difference. And we need more of that happening, frankly, at the state level. You know, for folks to come together that seem like they might be in disparate parts of the community in terms of their service orientation, but when you look at it as a whole, if you know that poverty is the underlying issue, collectively, those groups across the state could have a much bigger impact when it comes time for that next sludge session than we're going to as these kind of one-offs going up there to the Capitol.
So poverty equals food insecurity equals poverty.
Yes, there are some exceptions to that. And so nothing is so simple.
I wasn't trying to simplify.
Well, no, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a great thing it's important. I mean, generally speaking, absolutely, but we've been spending a lot of time doing serious research on this. So not everybody who's poor is food insecure. Not everybody who's food insecure is poor.
Okay.
So it's important to remember that, again, to sort of unpack the real issues so that we're not making decisions that are broad, sweeping, and based on potentially problematic ways of thinking. For the most part, yes. But we know that things like domestic abuse play into food insecurity significantly. And you package low-income community members, domestic abuse, maternal depression, you start to get very strong correlations back to food insecurity. But you don't necessarily have to have food insecurity. You can also just have domestic abuse. You can have maternal depression and get food insecurity. So I say that because it's a really critical piece to think about this broad sort of complex of issues. We have to think about it that way to get to these better solutions. I mean, it's a tragedy from my perspective. It kills me to think about, bad way to say it. It's a deeply challenging issue to think about moms that are in such bad situations in their house that they're not able to put food on their kids' plates, even though they have the money to do it. I mean, it's a really tragic and complicated issue, and unfortunately, probably not that uncommon, and probably not that uncommon here in Austin.
I want to take one more question from the audience. Something else, other theme is bubbling up.
We continue to have questions about food waste, which I know came up earlier. Even if it's not the thing we need to be focused on, what are the ways that we can address it from grocery stores to leftover food after events?
That's always a great question. I do know that we're going to be working on a story about a guy that goes around to Wheatsville Co-op and gets all the produce that's left over and takes them over to places.
He's here in the audience right now.
Oh. Hi.
And I'll give a shout out to Alan Schroeder is.
Hi, Alan. We're doing a story on you Friday.
And if you want to meet somebody who walks
and
the
we'll be at Meals on
talk.
Wheels Thursday.
I'll just, give a huge shout out to Alan. I see him all over the community, and every time I see him, he's almost always has his hands on produce, and usually it's produce being moved out of a grocery store from where it was not going to be sold into a place where low-income community members can access it. A critical piece of the whole puzzle. We have a really inefficient food system. Broadly, I like to think about it that our food is too cheap, and that way, going back to the great contradiction, it's so cheap that we think it's okay to throw it away. If our food was a whole lot more expensive, we wouldn't throw it away. I sold a $20 tomato one time at a farmer's market. Like, amazing moment. It was a 10-pound heirloom tomato. It should have actually, because we're selling them for $5 a pound, it should have been $50, but that seemed like a little bit expensive. So, but nevertheless, we sold, it was a $20 gorgeous heirloom tomato. That probably was eaten, I'm going to assume. Unfortunately, the vast majority of our food is deeply subsidized to the point where we don't value it. And so we end up throwing a lot of it away. There's lots of other issues around why we throw food away. But we can solve that issue. We as a society can absolutely create a more efficient system so that we're not disposing of food that's still edible. I would hope that we also put a lens on that where we prioritize healthy food and we prioritize recovering food from grocery stores and restaurants that's healthy and edible, and that we get that to our low-income community members or whoever wants to eat it. We just had a fantastic event called Feeding the 5,000. Many people in this room were part of that. Austin Resource Recovery, here represented in this room, was a huge part of that. We basically, or the coalition that organized this, was able to find, in addition to the food that's normally recovered, additional food that could be diverted. Great chefs participated, great volunteers, and the food bank was a critical part of helping us prepare that food and getting it to tables at the state capitol, literally fed. I think the number was around 3,000 people one afternoon a couple weeks ago. An amazing example of food that literally was going to end up in the trash that instead was able to feed thousands of people just because somebody, one person specifically named Gina McKinley, thank you, thought it was a really good idea to do this just to show the community that it's possible. It is important to remember that that is not going to solve food insecurity. It is not possible to solve food insecurity through better and more efficient food recovery. Food insecurity, as we touched on, is a complicated thing with lots of pieces, but it is a critical and vital thing that we do as a society, not just because it makes sense from a environmental point of view to reduce the amount of waste that we're producing, but also from a humanistic point of view. And to go back to Paul's point, it's the right thing to do. So,
Speaking of right things to do, we always end our Leadership Austin Engage breakfast with each of the panelists giving a call to action. What can our audience members do as individuals to make us more thoughtful on how we react to topics dealing with food insecurity? I'm going to start with you, Brian. Think of an actionable way these folks can tackle this issue.
Yeah, definitely. I would just say get involved. There's so many organizations doing great work. There's opportunities are plentiful to get involved. So find an organization, find a pet project or an issue that's important to you, get involved. I know at the American Heart Association, our grassroots program, we make it really easy for folks to get involved in the process, sharing your voice, helping out, volunteering, and advocating for public policies that address some of these issues. So that's what kind of we do, the space we work in, but find what drives you and get involved.
Rhonda?
I would say think about the decisions that you make every day when you eat food. I think all of us in this room are blessed to have pretty easy access to 2 or 3 meals a day. And I might be making an assumption there, and I apologize if that's the case. Think about that decision, the choice that you make where you purchase your food, the questions that you ask in your head or with the person that you're purchasing the food from. I think if we were all a little bit more conscious of this thing that seems like it's a given, we eat, the food is there, we eat it, it's fuel for our body. It's so much more than that. It's life. You know, it's culture, it's family, it's the environment. I mean, that's the reason I'm involved with SFC, is from an environmental perspective, what in the world are we doing to this planet that we're hoping to give to the next 7 generations if we continue to grow food the way that we're growing it right now? And so if I'll just think about that when I make my decisions about the food that I eat, I'm looking at overall health, physical health, environmental health, cultural health, and if you're keeping it local, economic health. And so I would just encourage all of you to think about that when you kind of vote with your fork every single day.
Vote with your fork. I love that. Edwin?
I'll just summarize that thought. Call your elected official, get involved, ask them to change the Farm Bill's name to the Food Bill. That single thing will significantly shift the way that we think about federal legislation and its role in our food system. It seems like maybe kind of an absurd thing just to change the name of a bill, but that one thing, I'm absolutely certain, and please, get involved, think clearly about that, and vote.
I want all of you to help me thank the panelists for doing the work they do in this community, fighting food insecurity on the front lines, and we know there's a lot more work to be done. Thank you all for sharing with us this morning.